Hello everyone, my name is Moonfasa, and in this series, I'm going to be showing you how to operate these starter decks you get shown at the beginning of the game, how to pilot these lists, how to analyze what sort of cards you should swap out, and new cards that you should put in, crafting charges you should spend, all of that stuff, anything you might need to know while you're a beginner player. If you don't know who I am, I've been playing this game for a long time. I have well over 2,000 hours now at this point, and I actually made a series like this in the past, but it was a streamed series, so those videos are like 3 hours long each, and I wanted to make something a little more digestible, because I think people would appreciate that a little bit more. If you want to watch those videos, though, to get more insight, you can go ahead after this video. We're going to talk about the green starter list today, and I'm going to get into a match later on to show you how to pilot this, but let's talk very briefly about the card choices here and how this deck is going to be operating. So I will also talk at the end on what sort of cards you should include in here, but we'll leave that till the end of the video. For now, let's just take a look at some very important features we need to look at before we actually dive into the match. And a big part of this is going to always be looking at your land counts. Now, counterintuitive to how the game actually operates, you start off with this empty board and you build up the board from scratch with you and your opponent, building lands from your power wheel, as I'm sure you've all experienced by now. This is very counterintuitive to how you should actually be playing to win the game. We'll talk a little bit about that later, but typically we want to have extreme importance on these land counts here. So a big thing to look for is what your maximum special land count is going to be in any of these decks. And we can see in this list here that it's going to be 3 forests with Grove Guardian, Horsemaster, Ancient Boar. If you don't know, these are wild symbols, so you can use any land types for these, but obviously we're playing a mono green list, so we're only going to be building forests. And so 3 forests. This is our maximum land count. We're going to keep that in the back of our minds for later when we get into the match. Apart from that, the next thing you really want to keep track of is how many creatures you're able to play on turn 2 or earlier. These are what we often call starting creatures. So cards like Farm Boy, for example, this can be played on turn 1, obviously. Costs 1 Faeria, it's a neutral card. But something also like a Bloom Sprite, this I would also consider a starting creature, because it can be played on turn 2. It costs 2 special forests, which you can build up over 2 turns. So there's a lot of cards in the starter decks that are considered as starting creatures. We've got Farm Boy, Village Elder, Imperial Guard, pretty much all of these cards in a row here, a bunch of the forest cards as well. And this is going to be important information to know when we get into the actual match and sorting out our mulligan. The next thing we want to look at is, and sort of decide, is what our win condition kind of is. Now, the starter decks don't have a ton of flexibility, I'm not going to lie to you. These decks aren't amazing, but you can do very well on the earlier ranks of Faeria's ranked ladder with these starter decks. A lot of this game is about skill rather than the decks you're running. Decks, of course, are important, but a lot of it comes down to skill. And hopefully this video can help you out with that a lot. One major card in this list to be aware of is the Ancient Beastmaster. Pretty much the only card to be aware of, I would say. Many of the other cards are quite simple in nature, but the Beastmaster really ties a lot of things together and gives you a lot of value here. So whenever you summon a creature with 5 life or more, it gets +1/+1. Very important creature to get out as early as possible. And for this reason, as we'll touch on later, you probably want to try crafting one of these as soon as possible. You don't unlock crafting right away, but as soon as you do, craft a 3rd copy of this. You can have up to 3 copies of cards in your deck. And this is a really, really strong card, especially in the earlier stages of the game, when you're fighting players who also have similar experience levels as you. So that's really the big card to pay attention to. Mono green is going to be a lot, it's going to have a lot of buffs focused around it, so you're going to notice cards like Tiki Caretaker as well, that gives buffs. This is, I think, the only buff card in this list, actually. aside from the Beastmaster, of course, but this is something we'll touch on a little bit later as well for card options to include in your deck. But anyways, let's get into a match. We can talk about this a little bit more in detail as we play. And when you're searching for a match, I would honestly recommend going for the ranked option on the right side here. This will just try and pair you with players of similar ranking to your own. If you go for casual, you're going to be kind of getting paired with anyone, and this could include very experienced players in the game, so I think your best experience is going to be in ranked. It just puts everyone at the same level, so I would recommend going for this. Alright, first match here is against Swept. And what we're going to get shown first here, you've probably seen this already, but this is the Mulligan. And what I'm going to be looking for is a starting creature, as I mentioned very briefly, so something that can be played on turn 2 or greater. And we're probably also going to try and toss as many high land cards as possible, which in this list is going to be 3 forests like this. Now, Tiki Caretaker is kind of a trick we can use. It's something our opponent's not prepared for, so we can hang on to this guy. We'll just toss the Grove Guardian here. And we get a Faeria. So, first 2 turns are going to go by pretty quickly. I'm not going to be able to speak very much, but I'm going to lock in just a double neutral here and explain why I do this in a sec. And I'm also going to dump down a sturdy Prairie Yak. So, remember when I said we've got 3 forests as our maximum land count? That's an important number to keep in mind. In a game, you want to build as little lands as you possibly can. Now, this is very counterintuitive, as I mentioned, because this game is kind of advertised as this game where you build lands back and forth with your opponent. This is not what you should actually be doing. You want to build as little lands as possible. Because of these 2 extra options we have here, the draw and the +1 option, these are very important to click as many times as possible. And because of that reason, we want to try and build as little lands as possible. Now, here I'm going to probably build another forest, or just my first forest, because I'm a little bit... I mean, I'm ready to play these double forest cards, so I'm going to play this. I'm just going to step up. This thing's nice and sturdy for now. I don't really have to play anything else, and I'm just going to pass from here. Now, the reason that I started with double neutrals is because we've got a 3 forest count, and I want all of these forests to be as in my opponent's face as possible, because these are also how you summon your forest cards. If I've got forests back here, they're not going to be doing a lot. Now, this is going to be different for different types of decks. 3 forests is quite a low land count, so we want to use these double neutrals to accelerate faster. Some decks, especially if you build some on your own, are going to be a lot more greedy on the land counts, and you're going to want to be building those special lands up rather than your neutrals. I also built towards the side here. This is how you should be playing most of your games. Like 95% of games should be played like this, where you go down one side of the wells to try and collect off of it. Now, you could go to both sides as well. This probably requires a lot more knowledge on archetypes and things, but for the starter decks, it's often better to just go down one side of the wells, because the deck's quite generous on low land cards, and because we're playing a lot of low land cards, we need to accelerate quickly to not get blown out by our opponent's high land cards in the late game, if that makes any sense. But anyways, we're gonna try and kill this thing off, and I'm gonna build my second forest here now to approach this, and I have an option here to actually buff. Now, I could go for the buff to preserve this HP of the Prairie, preserve the body. This is often a really good play, but I'm going to take a lot of damage from this 5-2 in the process, so I'm actually just going to straight trade in here, and we're going to dump a Bloom Sprite up here. We're going to dump the Imperial Guard as well. Now, there are some cards that you should be thinking about playing around eventually. I don't think this is super important at the beginning of your playthrough, but as you go through cards in the Faeria card collection, just scan through and see if there's any really devastating cards like removal cards especially. Removal being cards that can be played from hand and just kill a creature straight up. So one of the reasons that I went for the kill with the Prairiac there instead of buffing is because of removal cards. There's some very easy 1 damage options that red has access to. There's some easy 2 damage options too. So I just felt that the buff would be kind of wasted in that situation. Now here, we actually do have a kill. But always remember to think out your turn first before you do too much, because there's a lot of tricky things in this game to keep in mind. There's these land counts to keep track of. You have this card draw option, so if you're thinking of drawing a card, you should always click this button first. But another thing to keep in mind is Faeria wells on the board. These can give you a huge advantage in a game, and that's what we're going to go for right here before we take any moves. I want to build my 3rd forest here. I don't want to waste my lands trying to come up this direction. It's going to take way too long, way too many power wheel usages. Remember, I want to hit that +1 and draw option. So I'm going to build my 3rd and final forest between the wells. We're going to collect with it, and I want to eventually take this trade with the Tiki Caretaker. But since this Bloom Sprite actually generates me a card, I'm going to start with this, see if it gets me anything that might change my decision. That does not change my decision, so we're going to step this up first. We're going to buff. This is a little bit of a tricky play, perhaps. This gives me the kill, and then we're going to play our big Grove Guardian. So, yeah, a little bit of a tricky play there, but you can move your unit and then do some other action with your turn, like I did there. I played the Tiki Caretaker. And then attack after. So you're allowed to do this, and it can be very advantageous from a strategical standpoint. Now, my opponent has filled in his lands here with double neutrals to stop me from stepping onto his land and then producing an aggressive forest. This can sometimes be a fair play, but remember, we want to try to build as little lands as possible. So in this situation, I'm actually not going to be touching these lands ever again, unless I can get a really aggressive spot. And based on how my opponent is playing, that might not happen. Now, I have 3 Faeria worth of cards in hand, and I've got only 5 Faeria, or I've got 5 Faeria to spend. Way more than I have cards, so I'm actually going to take a card draw here, and I should have actually drawn first before I did my moves. As I mentioned, you should do this first. Silly moon. And we draw a Beastmaster. So, I'm probably just going to step back and pass from here. Really important in this game, especially if you're coming from other games like Magic, Hearthstone. Those types of games have this mana bank that refreshes every turn, right? So you're encouraged in those games to spend as much mana as possible every single turn, so that you're not losing mana. In this game, Faeria is cumulative, so you don't actually lose anything. I'll just pass the turn here, so we're not taking up too much of Swept's time. But you don't actually lose the game, you don't actually lose any Faeria in between turns, so it's very advantageous to hold onto your stuff if it's not going to really be that impactful. And you can see my opponent here building a ton of double neutrals. This is a huge mistake I see so often from beginner players, and I'm not going to blame anyone for doing this, because like I said, it's very intuitive to the gameplay to build as many lands as possible, but we should try to not do this in our games if we want to win. I mean, if you're just playing this game to have fun, then, you know, do whatever you like. Games are meant to be fun, but I assume if you clicked on this video, then you're trying to find some tactical strategies. I'm just going to throw this Wild Growth for fun, because it goes in a random location. I don't really have any control over where that goes. So from here, now, I'm going to take a card draw actually first to see what we get. And again, I did my moves before I drew a card. If I had done this in reverse like a good player, you see that I would have had a Horsemaster here, give it a friendly creature charge 3 this turn, and this would have allowed me to give it to the Grove Guardian. I can charge up to his face, and then produce, well, I couldn't produce a land there because I used my power wheel to draw, but it at least gets me a free face hit. And you can see, because I was so hasty with my moves here, and I drew first, or I drew last, sorry, I missed that free 5 damage. Now, in this situation, my opponent's starting to build up a lot of Faeria. I think I'm actually going to drop a creature here. I'm going to drop a Beastmaster. I'm going to drop it right here, and I'll explain why in a sec. So, the reason that I didn't play this creature or any creature last turn and I'm playing it now, because my opponent has a little bit more Faeria built up, so I want another creature on board to deal with the stats my opponent can play. But holding on to your cards as much as possible is good to do because it gives you options on what to play in the future, more options. Like, I had 10 Faeria there to choose on, like, whatever I wanted to spend things on, and there are cards like AoE in this game, where my opponent could get AoE being like deal X damage to all creatures on board. This is another reason to hang on to your cards. And the reason I put the Beastmaster backwards here is I'm kind of playing around this card Bomb Slinger, which can be played on a mountain and it deals 4 damage to an adjacent creature. Not super important right now to be playing around a ton of cards. I'm not going to blame any new player who plays into range of cards like this, but something that I'm aware of that you might not be yet. So, now my opponent played a massive creature here, so this is a big problem. We're going to draw cards, because again, we got a ton of Faeria to spend. And now I have a few options again. Since my opponent has played such a big creature, I'm going to try to just gain as much value as I can. And I should be okay, honestly. He spent a lot on this, and we just drew a big boy ourselves. So, I'm going to dump this Verduran Forest, which you can see will get buffed here from the Beastmaster. Very nice, so I'm going to try to protect this Beastmaster as much as possible. And now I'm not going to hit anything in here, since I can't kill it. But I am going to drop as many things as possible to try and deal with this. Now I want to be careful of AoE once again, but let's see, I've got 8 lined up, 13, I need 2 extra damage actually, but we did just draw a Falcon Dive there, so I'm actually going to dump the Village Elder and just hope that I don't get AoE'd. It's a lot less likely when my opponent's on such little Faeria though. Now, another thing to keep in mind is, I just want to point out once again, these Faeria Wells are very important in matches, so you want to try your best to collect as much as possible off of these Faeria Wells, but deny your opponent from collecting. Now, you can see this massive creature getting just juiced up with bigger and bigger stats, and as a new player, you might feel very discouraged seeing this big thing growing and growing and growing, and you're like, all I have is this dinky little farm boy and a Prairiac, how am I ever supposed to deal with this? But if you use certain strategies, certain other strategies than just stats, you're gonna do just fine. And one way to gain an advantage like this is just by collecting more than your opponent. My opponent hasn't been able to collect for a very long time because I also have taunts here, preventing this creature from moving. And that's really good for me. So I'm going to try to keep this guy locked down, prevent my opponent from collecting, and this means I'm gaining an extra 2 Faeria per turn on my opponent at any point in time. I'm going to just pre-hit this guy in because this draws me a card when it dies. See what else I draw, and we're just going to try and build up more and more value and try to keep this guy locked down. So I'm going to step this guy up, and I should actually realistically draw here. I know I've got a lot of cards in hand, but I just have such little weight here with the Farm Boy and the Prairiac. I want to draw beefier things like this Ancient Boar and the Grove Guardian. And then so from here, I'm just going to slap down some stats on boards. So this Ancient Boar comes down, he gets the Ancient Beastmaster buff. I'm just going to throw down another one to get more buffs. And once again, I'm not going to pre-hit in here. And I'll explain a little bit more about what I mean about this, because I didn't explain it super well, but you don't want to hit all of your stuff into a creature usually, unless you're guaranteed to kill it. The reason being is my opponent can only attack one of these creatures, which, I mean, it has to be the taunt. Since he can only attack one creature, that means I get choices on my next turn. I could just throw in my 8/8 here and try and kill this through other means in the future. But I may get a better opportunity that presents itself where I have a more efficient clear on this with a different creature. So let's say I hit in my 8/8 there. I have a Falcon Dive here to clean up, and that actually works out very perfectly. But if I didn't have this, I might have other options to clear this creature that are more efficient. Maybe I get like double buffs, and I could double buff this Ancient Boar or something to take a clean trade, and I think you get what I'm getting at. But the best trade here now we can see also is just going to be Slap and then Falcon Dive. Another reason to not hit all your creatures in though too is that Virgin Force was doing a good job blocking this land space. So that actually works out pretty well as well, because these special lands are very important. And let me just take this turn so I can, I'll talk about that a bit later. But I'm going to dump the Horsemaster here. We'll put it on the left side, sure. And then this lets me zip up this way, take that hit. And then now we're actually going to build our aggressive land. Now remember I said 3 forests is our max. I ended up getting a free forest over this way. And my opponent's actually just going to surrender there. It's okay to build your next, or your final land aggressively like this. Okay, there's a lot of things to speak about. I know I'm speaking at like 1,000,000 miles per minute, but a lot of things that I want to touch on in-game, because I think it's a lot easier to talk about in-game. But I just wanted to briefly touch on what I was talking about with blocking the lands. Special lands are very valuable. Once again, as I mentioned, you want to build as little land as you possibly can. Your opponent also wants to do this, and if you can then step on your opponent's special lands, like if I got to step on all 4 of my opponent's special lands here, suddenly my opponent can't play any cards. He can't play any creatures, at least. And so now my opponent has to build special lands, and this is not a good thing. Nobody wants to build special lands in a more competitive setting. So stepping on lands, very good thing to do. But with that match out of the way, let's get back into the deck builder real quick, and I'll talk about some improvements you can make upon this list. Okay, so after that real quick match that we just had, we're going to talk about some improvements we can make to this list. Now, obviously, that game went pretty smooth sailing, but I mean, I've played a lot of this game. I think I'm going to do quite well. If you're a newer player to the game, your games will probably last quite a bit longer. But just keep in mind some of those things that I talked about. Try to build only up to your maximum special land count, which is that 3 forests in this case. And try to get these forests as close to your opponent as possible. And that either means close to your opponent's orb, or close to where their lands are, where their summoning locations are. That's really important for this green starter type of list. But now, let's talk about some improvements. A lot of these cards, I'm not gonna lie, a lot of these cards suck. And you're going to probably notice that as you play through. But it can be very difficult to know what to swap out exactly. And what to include in your list, because there's a lot of options here. This game is unlike a lot of other card games out there. As I mentioned, Magic, Hearthstone uses a completely different mana system. So it can be very difficult to know just what sort of cards to craft even with your crafting charges. So first off, a big piece of this list, as I mentioned, is the Ancient Beastmaster. This is going to net you a ton of power. It's a really good card at a beginner level as well, because stats can be difficult to deal with for new players. This game can be highly positional and strategical, but without all of that strategical knowledge, stats can be king. So you're going to go very far if you just use a lot of Ancient Beastmasters. So I would highly recommend crafting 3 copies of this card. That would be my focus. And the nice thing about this card, actually, is whenever you summon any creature with 5 life, it gains a buff. You just gain a free buff. And for this reason, you can actually just include any creatures in this list that have 5 life or more, and you have a pretty decent list at a starting level. So, this especially works when you're opening packs at the beginning of the game and you don't really know what to include. If you get anything at all with 5 HP, include it in the list. And get rid of these cards that don't have 5 HP, like the Faeria is pretty bad, Village Elder is pretty bad in this list. They're all of these cards can be decent in their own sort of niches, their own sort of lists. But for now, I would focus on tossing like Village Elder, Faeria. These are probably the 2 main ones, and then maybe look at Imperial Guard and Farm Boy to get rid of next. Farm Boy is actually quite a decent card in the right list for it, but it is a very cheap card and a very frail card. You generally in this type of list want more beef in the list. So I would focus getting rid of those cards first, put a priority on that, and then just including anything with 6 HP, so definitely keep the Seed Sower in here, or the Steamforge Enforcer, the Silent Warrior. At least initially, these types of cards can eventually be tossed, but, and I'm going to show you a list that's a bit more competitive in a second too, to show you what the end goal would be for a list like this. But, yeah, so for now, just toss those cards that I just mentioned, and we're going to go through some of the cards that I think you should be crafting. And we'll start with the commons, because when you start your playthrough, you don't get access to every rarity of cards. You start with commons, and then you move to rares and epics. So we'll just start with the commons and briefly touch on these. Now I have all of the DLC cards unlocked. If you don't, then don't worry. I don't think you need any DLC cards whatsoever. I've mentioned multiple times that you don't need DLC cards to even be competitive in this game. So don't worry about any of that. A lot of the base set cards are going to be quite strong and able to get you to where you want to be anyways. So, first cards I would recommend is Elderwood Embrace. This card is very good at a beginner level. Just a straight up buff and a hand trick. And tricks from hand are very powerful in this game. You really want to build as many, or you want to hide as much information as you can from your opponent as possible. And then you have a surprise tool. So your opponent might play into a card like this. They might see that you've got maybe, let's say you've got like an Ancient Boar, a 4 or 5 Ancient Boar. And they're like, oh, this isn't like a super big stat line. Let me just step in range of this and we can trade stat lines. But then you've got the surprise buff in hand that buffs it to a, what's that, 6/9, which is kind of insane. Very big stat line, and your opponent's not expecting it. So Elderwood Embrace, very excellent cards. I would take a look at crafting these. Living Willow is actually pretty solid as well. This doesn't look very strong. You know, a 1/7 stat line, it's not a very big power number. It is a big HP, but the power kind of sucks, you might think. But this is actually a really insane card, and this is used at competitive levels as well. The great thing about Living Willow is that it scales really nicely with buffs. So, for example, Elderwood Embrace, if you use this on the Living Willow, suddenly it becomes a 3/11, and 3 power is like actually dealing some damage now. And then it's just got this massive HP stat. And in this game, you really want to have creatures stick to the board as much as possible to collect off those wells as much as possible. I know we briefly talked about wells, but I'll get more into that later in this series. But another card this pairs really nicely with is the Ancient Beastmaster. Like I said, you want 3 copies of this card, and then you just get a free +1/+1 buff here. It becomes a 2/8 suddenly for 3 cost, and already you're doubling its power, and it still has that really juicy HP stat. So Living Willow is a pretty solid card to go for as well. And now those are probably the 2 cards I would focus on crafting if you have crafting charges. Ancient Boar is very good as well, actually. So I would craft a third copy of the Ancient Boar. This is basically, especially when you get more 5-life creatures in this deck, this is going to be a 3-cost 4/5 that can also dash twice. So this is a very strong card. I would definitely include this. And from the commons, that's about all I would focus on. Again, if you're opening packs and you happen to get extra like 5 HP or higher creatures, toss those in for now to get rid of some of these little dinky cards. Shamanic Dance is okay if you open this from a pack. I wouldn't craft this card, but this can be pretty solid. Apart from that, that's about it in the commons. Seek Shelter is a very good card, but that is a DLC card, so only if you have the DLCs. We'll quickly look at the rares next. Now, there's neutrals as well you can include in this, but I wouldn't focus too much on the neutrals. Typically, neutrals aren't going to be that good. Now, in this particular list, I would keep the Horse Masters 100%. And until you get better cards, I would keep the Silent Warrior and the Steamforge Enforcer, but these two guys can be tossed eventually. Falcon Dive's a pretty decent card as well in mono green, so really I would hang on to the Falcon Dive and the Horse Master for the time being. In terms of rares, I'm going to talk about Feed the Forest a little bit later, but this is a very good card we'll talk about in a sec. Overgrown Tower's decent. I wouldn't craft this personally, but if you open these from packs, sure, go for it. Grove Caller is a very good card, which you could actually replace Horse Masters for. So this is a card that I would think about. I wouldn't include it just yet, or I wouldn't craft these just yet, but if you open these from packs, sure, go for it. Voice of Truth is a pretty solid counter pick to certain things that may be troubling you on the ladder. You noticed in that last match, we had this massive Ancient Board to deal with, which was like a 10-15. This just returns that back to a 4-5 stat line. So if you're struggling with massive statted creatures like that, Voice of Truth can be an option. Definitely consider this. Grove Guardian is one of the best green cards in the game, so I would definitely try to craft 3 of these guys. This one's just very strong. We'll talk about some of these cards a little bit later. Yeah, so that's about it. Verdurant Force is decent. This is decent at a beginner level, but as you get more competitive, this card's not very good. But like I said, stats can be very difficult to deal with at a newer level, just because you guys are kind of struggling to figure out the strategies and things, the deeper strategies in the game. So if you want to craft another one of these guys, these should do absolutely fine on the lower rankings. But let's look at the epics. Here, now epics, you have to wait a little while before you get able to craft these. I think it's level 15. But Runan's Guidance, very solid card. This card gives you a +2/+2 buff, which again, like Elderwood Embrace, it's a surprise tool, but then you also have the option to heal a god for 5, which is yourself. That's your player, your orb. And healing can be very good, especially into red decks, decks that have a lot of burn damage that just deal damage directly to you. The heal can be very nice for this. Now this is honestly a top tier card, so I would highly consider Ruden's Guidance if you have unlocked epics. Deepwood Stalker is a pretty solid card as well. This just does a lot for the card. It can fight an enemy creature, so that just means when it comes into play, you get to enter combat with any creature on the board. Well, any enemy creature on the board. And it's only a 2/4, but this thing can take away collectors from your opponent. Collector's very important. And then, hopefully, it survives. And then you get a collector yourself. So it can be very swingy, where it takes out a small little collector, like maybe a farm boy if they're running it, and then you can still collect. You can have this last as a collector yourself. Aside from that, that's it for the epics. But there is one card in neutral actually that's pretty solid, which is Emperor's Command. Now again, all of these epic cards aren't super important right off the bat, but this card is pretty strong if you have the crafting charges available for it. And I would actually replace the Falcon Dive with this card, just because it has a lot more flexibility. It can still deal that 1 damage. It does cost 2 instead of the 1 for Falcon Dive, but on top of that 1 damage that it does, you have other options as well. So you've got the healing as well, same idea with the Runin's Guidance, and then the structure damage doesn't come up that much, but really the biggest thing here is you can deal damage to a opponent's creature, or you can heal. That option is just really strong, so Emperor's Command, definitely a card to look out for. So those are the cards I would recommend crafting, at least near the beginning, and I mentioned which cards I would take out for those cards. Anything with 5 HP, if you're just opening random packs and getting random cards, anything with 5 HP is pretty good. Try to keep your land counts as low as possible, though. I would stick to 3 forests for as long as I possibly could, because, yeah, I mean, low lands counts are just the best. This allows you to draw more often, this allows you to gain extra resources, extra Faeria, and if you really want to, you could build double neutrals. But apart from that, that's where I would kind of stop with the green starter list before I start to delve into maybe better, more competitive decks. And the competitive deck that I'm going to talk about in a sec involves a 5 forest count, actually. So I mentioned I would talk about Feed the Forest again. So the competitive list right now for mono green is Green Beastmaster, and I'll plop it up on screen here so you have some reference. This is a list that I've taken to many tournaments in the past and done very well with. So this is a competitive list, and it uses a 5 forest count, actually, because there are some very powerful cards at 5 forests. So Feed the Forest is one of those cards. This just gives you an absurd amount of Faeria, and it draws you a card, so a lot of resources. You have to sacrifice a creature for it, but a lot of your creatures are just high HP stats anyways. And the other 5 land cards in green is the Tyrian Golem. Very strong card as well. This is a 5 cost, 5/10, which is huge for the stats. Insanely efficient card. It's got no card text, but it doesn't need it, because this thing's just a giant slapper that comes down. But you do need the 5 forest count built up for this. So I mentioned you probably don't want to craft Feed the Forest with this green starter list. You probably don't want to craft the golems right away either. Really, when you make that jump up to 5 forests, you need to go all in on that 5 forests. You can't just throw in 1 Tyrian Golem in this deck, because it's just going to be really bad. You need a lot of synergy in that sort of 5 forest threshold, and that means you want 3 Tyrian Golems and 3 Feed the Forest. And if you don't have 3 of each, then don't include any of those cards in the list, in my opinion. It's just not going to work out for you very well, and the strategies play quite a bit differently. So when you're on 5 forests, in this sort of Beastmaster list, actually, you're going for a lot slower of a game plan. So you're not going to be building those double neutrals, as I mentioned with the green starter deck, because you've got more lands to build up. You have 5. And this is a value-oriented list, so you're going to be playing cards like the Beastmaster, and then you're also going to be playing just other really long-term cards like Aridin, which gives +1/+1 buffs to all the creatures in your deck. The longer the game goes on, the more value you get out of these sorts of cards. And so that's what I mean about kind of, it's a different game plan. This Beastmaster deck over on the left here wants to play very slow, to build up as many buffs as possible, and then that just overwhelms your opponent in the late game, so it plays quite slowly. But the green starter list, and as you'll see later in this series, all of the starter lists play very fast, just because of all the neutral cards they have included in here and the very low land count. So they need to play fast, because if you're playing against something like this Beastmaster list you see on the left, the player on the left is going to get these really efficient cards like Tyrian Golem, and meanwhile you're playing cards like Grove Guardian, which is a very strong card at this land count, but 5/10 compared to a 5/6, there's really no contest. So as soon as your opponent starts hitting those 5 land thresholds, they're just gonna outvalue this deck a lot. But yeah, that's basically the goal. On the left here, this would be the deck that I would be aiming to get to. I'm not going to really get into too many details. I don't want to make this video super long. It is super long. Hopefully this helped, and I will see you over in the next video where we'll talk about the red list. So thanks for watching, and hope to see you there.